Good afternoon. My name is Chip Gibbons, and I am the Policy Director of Defending Rights and Dissent. The extradition of Julian Assange has been called the press freedom trial of the century. Oh, hold on one second. That is a mistake. I had the YouTube video link open in another window, so I was wondering why I was hearing myself. Good afternoon. I am Chip Gibbons, Policy Director, Defending Rights and Dissent. I apologize for that brief technical difficulty. The extradition of Julian Assange has been called the press freedom trial of the century. At stake is not just the life and liberty of journalist Julian Assange, but also the future of the First Amendment in the United States and press freedom everywhere in the world. The U.S. government is seeking to apply its Espionage Act extraterritorially to an Australian journalist and publisher for publishing information about the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the dirty backroom deals of the State Department, and the U.S. prison camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And now, thanks to the British High Court, the U.S. is one step closer to getting its hands on Julian Assange. To discuss last Friday's ruling and its ramifications, Defending Rights and Dissent has assembled a truly expert panel. I present to you, all the way from Rome, Stefania Maurizi, an Italian journalist who has worked since 2009 with WikiLeaks to report in the press on their revelations, working on such important stories as the Afghan war logs and, yes, Vault 7. She also was the Italian journalist who reported on the Snowden documents pertaining to Italy and is the author of a book in Italian on Julian Assange. I will not embarrass myself by trying to mispronounce its Italian name, but I'm told there will be an English translation published next year, which I am looking forward to reading. We're also joined by Jeffrey Sterling, who is uniquely qualified to comment on Assange's case, as Jeffrey stood trial under the Espionage Act, under which Assange is charged, in the Eastern District of Virginia, where the U.S. is trying to extradite Assange to. Jeffrey is a former CIA case officer turned whistleblower, a journey he recounts in The Unwanted Spy, The Persecution of an American Whistleblower, which is behind me on my bookshelf. I highly recommend Jeffrey's book. It's an amazing book. And if after this broadcast you read the book and you still can't get enough Jeffrey, you're in luck, because he also appeared on our podcast, Primary Sources, where we interviewed him about the same topic matter, which can be found at primarysourcespodcast.org. Buy Jeffrey's book, listen to the podcast. You won't regret either choice. And last, but certainly not least, is my friend Kevin Gosztola, managing editor of Shadowproof, curator of the Dissenter newsletter, and co-host of Unauthorized Disclosures. Kevin covered the Chelsea Manning court-martial, the Assange extradition, and the war on whistleblowers broadly. His first-hand reporting has been indispensable to our work at Defending Rights and Dissent, and he is the next guest on the Primary Sources podcast. Jeffrey, Stefania, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks to
My
you.
pleasure. Thank you.
Stefania, I really want to start with you because the last time we did one of these broadcasts, you discussed Julian's health. You've obviously known Julian since 2009. You mentioned meeting with him in the embassy and giving him a copy of a book by Gore Vidal and talking about Gore Vidal living by the sea in Italy and how Assange closed his eyes, and you asked him why he was doing this. And he mentioned, I'm trying to imagine what it's like to be free, words that have stuck with me since then so much that I quoted them in my Jacobin piece on the High Court appeal. You were very concerned with Julian's health last time based on how he appeared during the hearing. We now know that Julian had suffered a stroke that day, a mini stroke. It's shocking and appalling news. As someone who has known Julian for a long time, who saw him on the live stream during the High Court appeal, what do you make of the news that Julian has suffered a mini stroke, and how concerned are you right now with Julian's health?
Well, Chip, I think this is a very important question because it goes to the heart of this case. I mean, I have been working, as you said, on the documents since 2009, and even if I had not met Julian in 2009. I met him in 2010, and I have seen him in all sorts of situations, very stressed, very depressed, trying to fight, never to admit he was weak. So I have seen Julian in this last decade in all sorts of situations. But when I saw him during the last court hearing, the appeal hearing at the British High Court, I was upset. I could barely recognize him. It was terrible. I could barely recognize him. So I realized Julian is such a bad shape. Julian is extreme risk, serious health risk when I saw him. And so this news that he had a mini stroke, which unfortunately I know very well because my father had also that kind of health problem. So I know what it means to live in fear of this kind of mini strokes, which can be the beginning of a massive stroke. And you you die, or maybe you are seriously invalid, and you are seriously uh, you're destroyed basically. So I live in fear. I live in fear that every morning I wake up and I fear he might commit suicide. That is also an extremely serious risk. Or he might have a very serious, a major stroke or a major health problem, which of course in prison he would be unable to address. I mean, we see how the hospitals work in these days. We have a very good health system in Italy. It's free, it's public, but they cannot address this COVID crisis. So each time you have to go to you have a health problem, you wonder whether the hospitals will be able to address it, unfortunately, because in these days it's very, very complicated, even for us, which are free and able to access some of the best hospitals. Imagine what it means in a high security prison. Imagine in these days with COVID and with with this kind of health crisis. I believe they won't be able to address any serious health crisis, any serious health problem. So I'm really terrified that he can die any day. I think it's real. It's not an exaggeration. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not emotional when it comes to this case. I'm describing what I have seen with my eyes and what I have seen after, dealing with this case, looking for the documents, which have been a tremendous work, and reading how the UK authorities approach, for example, his health. If you read the Crown Prosecution Service correspondence, when they tried to extradite him to Sweden, they had no concern, no interest in his health, in the deterioration of his health. They use quite blunt and not really respectful words for his health. So I don't believe they will protect his health at all. And indeed, we have seen how they have done. They have done all they could to let it deteriorate for the last 10 years, to an extent that he now has this serious health condition and mental health condition. So I have no trust that they will protect his health, of course.
Jeffrey, I mentioned at the beginning you're uniquely qualified to comment on this case because you had the great misfortune of being indicted under the Espionage Act in the Eastern District of Virginia. But there's another reason why you are uniquely qualified to comment on this case, having had health care problems in the U.S. prison system. What is healthcare like in the U.S. prison system, and how confident are you that if Julian came to the US, he would get reasonable mental and physical healthcare treatment based on your own experience, obviously? Jeffrey, you might be muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. Healthcare is non-existent in the U.S. prison systems. And that's also including any of the lower level jails within the United States. An inmate's health is certainly an afterthought. They may do what they can to keep you from dying, but other than that, there won't be any real assistance, even though going into prison, you are assured of receiving adequate health care. As you had mentioned, I had some serious health issues while I was in the federal prison in Denver. Their answer to, and mine was heart related. I felt like I was having a heart attack. Their answer to me was to drink more water. And then continually denying me health care and blaming it on me, saying that I was making it up, that I was taking it more seriously than it was. The individuals there, in some instances on the so-called health staffs, I even wondered if they were qualified to do their jobs. I'm not a healthcare professional, but there's just so many obvious things that were either not tended to, neglected, or not even known about. And I think that's across the board in U.S. prisons. And I think with regard to Assange, he will not receive adequate health care in the U.S. prison systems. And by the way, that also includes the Alexandria jail, where he will be held if he's extradited. That'll probably be his first point of confinement here in the U.S. I had some health issues there. They were not tended to at all, even especially my mental health. I did go through phases of feeling suicidal. I remember when I was in the federal prison, the psychologist on staff threatened to put me in solitary if I didn't stop feeling so mentally down. And that would have just made a situation worse. So that is their answer. It's always the inmate's fault. It's up to the inmate to make himself better. And given Julian Assange's condition now, it will only deteriorate once he hits U.S. prisons.
And Jeffrey, my understanding from people who have been in the Alexandria Detention Center is that there is no mental health counseling there. There is drugs; they'll give you drugs, but you don't actually have access to a counselor. In your experience, do you know if that's true or not, or?
Oh, that's absolutely true. I received no counseling when I was at the Alexandria Detention Center. Actually, I was just put into a cell and left there. I was not out of that cell days on end. It felt like I was in indeed solitary confinement. I was there for a number of weeks, and there could be more than a week where I never got out of that cell. There is no attention towards mental health. The main emphasis is just keeping you locked up, locked away. Whatever happens to you, I think the attitude in the prison systems is whatever happens to you, so be it. They're not going to assist. And that was my experience at the Alexandria Detention Center.
And you are the second person to confirm that to me. I just want to clarify for people listening at home that both Jeffrey and someone else who I will not name have both confirmed to me that they do not offer counseling services at the Alexandria Detention Center. They offer medication, and that is it. Because the U.S. Attorney Gordon Kronberg, in his declaration, talked about how great mental health treatment Julian Assange could receive at Alexandria was, which I've several people who have been detained there, and my understanding is that is a lie, to put it quite bluntly. Kevin, this is a very sort of convoluted legal process. Whenever I'm in discussions where people are trying to figure out precisely what's happening at this stage, everyone always has the same response. Let's ask Kevin what's going on. So we have you on the panel today, so I'm going to ask you, what were the issues that the UK High Court considered, and what were their decision on Friday?
Well, yeah, and it's worth spending a little time additionally on the medical care issue as it relates to this High Court decision, because it's pretty clear that the untested assertions and claims by this U.S. attorney, Gordon Kronberg, who, at this point has taken on a status that makes me feel like we should be saying it's he who must not be named. But But at no point has Assange's legal team been able to cross-examine and challenge these things that are being said about the U.S. prison system that are not based on reality, which Jeffrey knows from his own experience are not true, but also prison policy experts know it's not true. People who report on the U.S. prison system know it is not true. And yet, I have this example ready for this panel to just read because it says, and I really can't believe that they have this in the declaration to Britain, especially when they actually have a national healthcare system in the UK. But Kronberg says, similar to health insurance plans, and so he would be talking about private health insurance plans. There's no like public health insurance system in the US. The Bureau of Prisons has a defined scope of services which determines the care provided to inmates in its custody. Medically necessary care is provided to all inmates. Elective health care, which may improve quality of life, is assessed on a case-by-case basis through a process called utilization review. Healthcare with limited medical value or expressly for the inmate's convenience is not routinely approved. The final category of care is extraordinary and must be approved by the Bureau of Prisons medical director. And I'm just focused on that aspect there because this whole thing of insurance plans should be a signal that you're going to be denied care in prison right away, because that's the way our corporations function, to extract the most from customers while providing the least amount of care for the insurance that you are paying for from wherever you're receiving that medical attention. And it would probably be even worse in prison for Julian Assange. And also what Jeffrey was saying about being accused of faking symptoms, Julian Assange has already in this extradition case been accused of faking symptoms. The Crown Prosecution Service have deployed this storyline that Julian Assange is reading the British Medical Journal and trying to figure out ways in which he can act like he's suffering from certain psychoses so that he could be diagnosed as suicidal by a medical doctor, even though there is no evidence to support this at all. And even the district judge who initially blocked this extradition request didn't buy that theory. And looking at this diplomatic assurance, which I think has received the least amount of attention of the four. We've talked a lot about special administrative measures. We've talked about going to a supermax prison. We've had a lot of attention to the potential of a prisoner transfer to Australia if Assange is convicted, which were all things that the High Court emphasized as weighing in the direction of granting the U.S. appeal. But we haven't spent a lot of time on medical care. And I just want to say quickly here that the Marshall Project a couple years ago did an examination of the Bureau of Prisons policy because they said something to the effect of that they were going to begin emphasizing more having more staff and resources available for people who have mental health problems in the U.S. incarceration system. And what the Marshall Project was able to find is that, in fact, even though they talked about making this a priority, what they were doing is actually, since they didn't have enough staff for this, then they could not provide the medical care. So you had constantly staff at these facilities downgrading prisoners so that they would not meet the threshold necessary for receiving the medical attention that they needed. And that's what I think Julian Assange can look forward to, or what people can expect if he is brought to the United States, is that once he gets there, he will receive that customary assessment that looks at everything that has to do with his physical condition and his mental condition. But eventually, they're going to start finding reasons why he doesn't meet the most extreme categories that would have him receiving around-the-clock attention. And he is actually receiving pretty constant medical care in the Belmarsh high security prison currently. It's less than it was in the immediate months after he was detained and brought there, if I understand everything correctly. But he is still receiving a level of care that is extraordinarily unusual in U.S. prisons.
And if I can add to that, the prison administration, they will spend more effort in downgrading or defending themselves against not providing adequate care. They will spend more effort with that than actually providing the care, go through more machinations when it will be easier to just provide care. In my instance, the only reason I was received the medical care, the vital medical care that I needed, was because, thanks to the efforts of my wife and thousands of followers who bombarded the prison with letters and phone calls, and eventually the attention of a U.S. senator. That's what it took for me to receive adequate health care. Now, the U.S. was claiming about assurances of health care for Assange. What assurance does he have that that level of attention is going to come to his health plight to make a prison provide him care? I think he has no assurance of that in any way, shape, or form. And what he is going to experience is the U.S. prison system's version of healthcare, which is no care at all.
That is horrifying, unfortunately, for those of us who are aware of how the prison system treats prisoners generally, and whistleblowers in particular. It's not a surprise to us, but something doesn't have to be surprising to shock and offend our conscience. Kevin, I do want to go back to the legal questions because we're getting some questions from web viewers, including Barbara, who wants to know, is there a court above the UK High Court? Who's the defense appealing to? What comes next? So, and you threw out the term SAMs and ADX Supermax, which I think we're familiar with on the panel, but I don't know if everyone watching knows what a SAM, special administrative measure, is. So if you could, Kevin, sort of walk us through the issues that were raised on the appeal and what the High Court decided and what comes next for the legal case to basically save Julian's life.
Yeah, very quickly, the special administrative measures are these confinement conditions that the executive branch of the United States government can impose on the advice of people in agencies that are connected to national security or intelligence operations, so they can assess a prisoner as posing a national security threat, and they can further restrict communications, movement, and do it with the justification that this is all necessary to the good order of the United States, so to speak. And in fact, it's not very abstract. The discussion about this potentially being imposed on Julian Assange is not a very abstract thing to contemplate, because in fact, the alleged source, who actually his first trial ended in a mistrial, but the alleged source of Vault 7 documents from the CIA, which WikiLeaks published, his name's Josh Schultz. He is in special administrative measures in a prison in New York, which I actually understand has been shut down. They're no longer bringing new defendants since it was in such utter disrepair. The Supermax prisons in ADX Florence, Colorado, and that facility is, again, a more extreme form of controlling prisoners, keeping people in cells for, around 22 to 23 hours a day in some examples, limiting recreation. But however, visits aren't as restricted as they are in a communications management unit, which is something that we may raise further later on in our discussion of these issues. And then there's the prisoner transfer to Australia, which was one of the assurances that was offered to the UK High Court. However, I question the prominence that this has been given and the weight that this has been given, because it is part of an agreement that the US has with Australia, and any Australian who was ever in the U.S. custody would have the ability to demand that they be transferred to a prison in their home country. But all the U.S. is saying is that Julian Assange, if he's brought to the United States, would have the right to apply for a transfer. They're not saying they would grant the application. They're just saying they would consider the application, which isn't much of a concession, because anyone would have that regardless of whether they told a court that that was something that was available to a defendant from Australia. And this is the arrangement that existed between Spain and the US. And we have a case involving a prisoner who was accused of drug trafficking, who was promised that he would be able to serve out his sentence in Spain and then was denied that ability. This is the Mendoza case that came up in the appeals court proceedings. So if it's okay, I'll move on and just mention that you asked a question about where this would go next. There's going to be an appeal by Julian Assange's team by December 23rd, and they'll ask the British Supreme Court for a review of this High Court decision. And then the Supreme Court will decide whether they're going to hear the appeal of the appeal from Assange's legal team. And then going forward, it'll all depend on what that Supreme Court has to say.
Thank you, Kevin. And another audience question I got from Robert was, who is doing all the cool graphics and sirens on this broadcast? And they're very cool, and they're being done by Quentin Anthony Anderson, our communications director at Defending Rights and Dissent, who is the unsung hero of these broadcasts, as he does all of the background stuff that makes this look so professional. My next question is for Stefania. We've been talking a lot about Julian's health. We've been talking a lot about the U.S. prison system, because that's where the appeal has gone. But as I started off, this is the press freedom case of the century, as Ryan Grimm has called it, and I 100% agree with Ryan on that one. Could you explain to us, as someone who has covered the various WikiLeaks revelations for however long ago 2009 was, can you explain to us what is the importance to journalism, to the understanding of the public, of information about government and corporate misconduct, of what WikiLeaks and Julian Assange has done? Because I think a lot of people don't understand the significance of WikiLeaks or Assange, or they have very, very negative impressions of them.
Yes, of course. I mean, they started the revolution. I mean, it goes beyond what they revealed, what they have allowed us to know. It really started the revolution, because for the first time they allowed not just the journalists, but even the public opinion to access the dirty secrets of what I call the secret power, the highest level of power, the power which you don't see. I mean, at least in Europe, maybe in the US, you have a better perception of this kind of power, but you don't see this power in the talk show, in the news. You see this power is likes to operate in the shadows. It's a kind of power which doesn't appreciate the transparency, the light. They want to operate in complete secrecy. So for the first time, Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks journalists, because let's not forget, this is not just a case about Julian Assange. It is also a case about the whole WikiLeaks journalists and tech people. They are at risk, as he is. Even if they are not in prison at the moment, they risk their lives in prison, as Julian does. So for the first time, they have allowed the public, billions of people, to access the dirty secrets of this secret power and to get factual information, objective information on how this power operates in secrecy, when this power plans wars, torture of entire nations, wars and destruction of entire nations. So we have seen this with Iraq, with Afghanistan, Libya, we have seen with Syria. So and this revolution has been so, I mean, so critical for us, for crucial for us, because never before we had this systematic access to this information. Of course, we had Daniel Ellsberg, and he was the pioneer. He was the first hero of this tradition. But I mean, it was never before it was we had this massive access to this documentation, and of course, the revelations are crucial. They revealed, the documents about Afghanistan. For the first, I remember how excited I was. I mean, of course, I was excited while watching Collateral Murder and the war crimes, which it definitely reveals. Next February, we will read the book of the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer. This book has a good chapter in which Nils Melzer, who is an expert on rules of engagement, he was previously working for the Red Cross, and he was in the war theaters in many countries. So he analyzed the Collateral Murder video, and he clarifies the war crimes exposed by this video is a much necessary analysis to analyze these war crimes, because never before, no one, after it was published, no one tried to analyze this video beyond what the images we have seen. So, I mean, I was really excited when we got the documents about Afghanistan. I really remember vividly what happened. It was, I mean, I remember how it was the last time I met Julian Assange as a free man. It was basically in September 2010. We met to work on these documents because they had published 76,000 documents, and they have put aside 15,000 documents to protect sources, to protect what the United States claim were the vulnerable people, the people who were translators for the US and coalition forces, who were informants, who were people alerting the troops. And I remember how we work on these documents. And when we met in Berlin to work on these documents, I remember that I did not realize that was the last time I would have met Julian Assange as a free man. After after that meeting in September 2010, I always met Julian under house arrest at Hellingham Hall inside the embassy for 7 years, where I visited him for many times, and it was so painful to see Julian in those conditions. So I remember the Afghan war logs and how how me and my colleagues were excited to look at these documents, which were providing an extraordinary window on this war. And we could read what was happening behind the propaganda machine. We could understand how this war was nonsense. And in fact, we now know it was complete nonsense. So we now know it was a complete disaster. I mean, and we could know the secret war. We could see the secret war because we could read about this secret task force operating in Afghanistan, like Task Force 373. And so I was so excited to read and research this documentation, which allowed us for the first time to look the war in real time behind the propaganda machine. And the same with Iraq war logs. But the most explosive experience was with the cables. For the first time, we could access to the non-PR version of world event from Italy to Pakistan to Britain to Spain, and we could discover scandal. We could understand the pressure on our authorities. For example, in the case of the CIA extraordinary rendition, we could have evidence of this pressure, because before this publication, we could, of course, guess that there were pressure on our justice system, on our politics to provide impunity to the CIA agents responsible for the CIA extraordinary rendition in Italy, in Germany, and in other countries. But thanks to these documents, we got factual, solid evidence. So, I mean, their revelation have been so important. And in fact, even to these days, 11 years after they were published, they are still used by scholars, by journalists. So we always go to these archives and look for some tiny bits of information, even if they goes back to 11 years ago. They are so important. But let me tell you, Chip, it's not just about us. It's not just about the journalists. It's not just about the scholars. It's not just about the researchers or peace activists or war activists or whatever you want, which who can consult these documents. It is about the public who, for the first time, has access to this information. I want to tell you this: we are infamous. Italy is in infamous countries when it comes to the so-called strategy of tension. During the 70s, we had terror attacks by the far right. We had a big communist party, and we had these terror attacks against civilians. So they put bombs in our trains, in our buildings, and dozens of Italian people died each time. So 60 years after, we don't have truth and justice about these terror attacks. Well, each time WikiLeaks publish some database, I got calls or contacts from the families of the victims asking me, please look in the document, please uh, look for any information about this case, because maybe they have some important information, some tiny bits of information. This tells you a lot of how normal people, feel empowered by these documents, because they are not available just to the journalists. They are not available just to privileged people, just to the researcher, to the people who are expert on certain fields. They are available to everyone. Everyone can access them. Everyone can use them for research. Everyone can use them for writing articles, for for appealing to the courts, for making his own mind on world affairs. So these publications have been empowering communities all around the world. That's the real revolution. The real revolution is how they opened a gaping hole in the secret power, making these dirty secrets available to everyone, and how they empowered entire communities by allowing them direct access to these dirty secrets.
Thank you, Stefan. That is a wonderful summation of why these WikiLeaks revelations are so important. And as an organization who prides itself on using the slogan that we fight for, I always get the slogan backwards, and my boss always yells at me. Your freedom to know and your right to act. That embodies sort of the ethos that we believe in. You mentioned Neil Mesler's book. I have an advanced copy of it. When it comes out in February, you're going to want to read it. I'm already discussing with people how to get it in the hands of members of Congress. It's extremely important. And I can just say from my own experience as someone who was involved in the anti-Iraq war movement in the U.S., who worked with veterans of the Iraq war to do these public testimonies about what they witnessed, just how important the WikiLeaks revelations were for that work. I was working at an NGO in New York City shortly after Collateral Murder came out as a video, and one of the soldiers from that video came to our office and talked about his experiences trying to alert the public about what had happened in that video, and getting nowhere, and just, it was really gut-wrenching to listen to, and how that video had empowered his testimony. And another soldier who I had seen speak at Red Emma's in Baltimore turned out to have been in that unit and went around talking about, yeah, this is what I've been trying to tell people. There's two types of censorship in our society. There's official censorship, which is what Assange is facing with the Espionage Act, which is how the classification system is used. And then there's also the unofficial censorship, where we all know, we can all go talk to whistleblowers and soldiers and civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan who live with the brutality and the violence of the U.S. imperial wars. And for some reason, we don't ever hear their voices. And WikiLeaks' their great crime was to break through both the official and the unofficial censorship. We're getting sort of short on time. Kevin, could you give us a very brief, I know I always say that, a very brief summation of what is the U.S. government case against Julian Assange look like?
The U.S. case against Julian Assange looks like a conspiracy theory that I would be happy if YouTube and Twitter and Facebook wanted to start militantly removing from the internet because it isn't based in fact. That's just the way that I see it. And since you have a really brief amount of time to discuss it, their idea is that Chelsea Manning doesn't really have agency, that she isn't a whistleblower, that she's not the one who made the choice to release documents, and that WikiLeaks and particularly Julian Assange pieced together this most wanted leaks list. And it was just a wiki document. It was a place where people around the world, human rights attorneys, activists, people at nonprofit organizations, press freedom organizations could put documents on this list from all over the globe that they wanted to see forced out into the open because they would probably reveal corruption. And they've made a big deal out of how this most wanted leaks list that was posted on a wiki tied to WikiLeaks is the roadmap that Chelsea Manning used. The only problem was made clear by defense attorney David Coombs during Chelsea Manning's court-martial, which is that 93%, if not more, of those documents on that most wanted leaks list. And by the way, this is in the indictment. This is the only reason why I'm saying this. Otherwise, this would be really stupid to waste time. But they say that this is the roadmap, and David Coombs pointed out that 93% of those documents were never searched for. They were never of any interest to Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning meticulously combed through sets of documents, and in her work found the sets that we've discussed today that Stefania was referring to, the war logs, the cables. She came across detainee assessment briefs from Guantanamo, and she had her own sets of reasons, which she articulated very clearly, and that's why she went to WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks wasn't even the first place that she wanted to submit the documents. She tried the New York Times, the Washington Post. She very nearly went to Politico with some of the documents. And eventually she realized the anonymity that was offered through submitting through this system online was going to be the easiest mechanism for sharing and providing the extensive number of documents that she had. And those went and were transferred to WikiLeaks. And yet we still hear from these prosecutors a continued push of this theory that somehow she was recruited and put up to this by WikiLeaks. And that's part of what you hear in the allegations against Assange, that he solicited her, that he was asking her to provide certain documents to WikiLeaks, that it went beyond journalism, and that now he was trying to get her to hack into systems. Again, another part of the theory, the conspiracy theory that this Justice Department has been pushing forward, that there was hacking. No, Julian Assange was maybe in chats with Chelsea Manning. They haven't definitively proven that he was using that account that was being used by him and his conversations with Chelsea Manning, but that she had a security clearance in these databases for accessing these databases, and so she didn't need Julian Assange's help to move through them anonymously, which is a claim that prosecutors have made. They they make these really ridiculous assertions about things that don't make any sense, but it's just good enough for them to continue this political prosecution.
Yeah, so Jeffrey, I want to come to you now because
Mhm.
we don't have time to get into all the details of your trial. Your case is very different than a lot of other Espionage Act whistleblowers in that you denied the government's allegations, you went to court, you fought them, um, you have maintained your innocence. I think people are going to say, "Oh, Chip is just friends with Jeffrey." Of course, he says, Jeffrey was in the right, but having looked at that evidence and someone who does have a legal degree, I mean, the government did not prove its case against you beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, if I was teaching a law school class and I wanted to put together a textbook case for reasonable doubt, I would put forward the facts your attorneys put forward at that trial. Okay, you had one of the strongest cases for reasonable doubt I've ever seen. The jury still returned a conviction. They heard from Condoleezza Rice. I think the Eastern District is the only place in the world where the person who's most famous for saying don't let this smoking gun come in the form of a mushroom cloud would have any veracity. Um, and in the third indictment against Assange, they used this conspiracy to commit computer intrusion charge, which is separate than the 17 Espionage Act charges, to bring it into general allegations. All of this, quite frankly, information about Assange that will be very perceived very derogatorily in the Eastern District, and that information that, absent this conspiracy charge, I think would be barred from a courtroom because it has just no probative value other than just prejudicing the jury. When a jury in the Eastern District hears some of these things, that like names like Chelsea Manning or that Julian Assange allegedly or not allegedly did try to help Edward Snowden seek asylum, that he spoke at conferences where there were hackers, that he gasped, shock, disapproves of the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What is going to be the impact of that information on a jury in the Eastern District of Virginia? And what are the chances of Julian, if he is, and we're all hoping this never happens, extradited to the Eastern District, getting anything resembling a fair trial?
Yeah. The type of panel he's going to face in the Eastern District is going to be completely biased against him. My panel, just about every member of the pool from which my panel was drawn from, had some sort of tie to the U.S. intelligence community. So there's going to be a leaning towards upholding the standards as presented by the government of what is expected out of those who work in that area, and automatic belief about the dangers presented by the information that was revealed at question. The thing is, with the Espionage Act, it is such a broad stroke that instead of having legal specifics, all the government really has to do is get involved in character assassination. And that is exactly what they've been doing with Assange for years. It's going to come down to, if he does face trial under the Espionage Act here in this country, it's going to be a continued character assassination because the government will not have to present any evidence of harm. They won't have to reveal to Assange any evidence against him if they consider it classified. That tactic did not work for me because any of the classified information that the government wanted to use against me, I had already had access to. So there was no way that they could justify denying my access to that. Well, Assange won't have that sort of guarantee. But he's going to face a panel that has already seen his image basically equated with a terrorist to this country. The viewpoint is going to be skewed against him and in favor of the US government. And that's what he's going to be facing. It is completely one sided and biased, again, with that broad stroke of using the Espionage Act, which can bring in just about anything, but the government won't be required to actually prove any of their charges. So he is fighting. If he does eventually end up in trial, it is an impossible task to fight against the Espionage Act. I had some guarantees of our Constitution that were actually not used for my benefit. But Assange won't have any of those guarantees. there is no way he can have any sort of fair chance in a U.S. court, especially the Eastern District of Virginia, to fight any of these spurious charges that the U.S. has claimed against him.
And we've gotten a very interesting question in the website chat. Any of the panelists can take it. It's about, what do you think of the hypocrisy that today the EU is honoring the Russian dissident Navalny? And Navalny is someone, in my estimation, someone who has faced legitimate persecution from the Putin government, and it is legitimate to support him against that persecution, even though some of his political views that are not often publicized these days in the West are rather loathsome. That doesn't change the fact that political persecution is persecution. What do we make of the hypocrisy with the EU championing Navalny while the British UK High Court is talking about sending Assange to the US?
I think that characterizes the hypocrisy of it all. If Russia was a part of the grand acceptable world, NATO and the like, then there wouldn't be this support for Navalny. Assange has gone up against the U.S., which is its presence throughout the world is unquestioned. So what country is going to stand up against the U.S.? Clearly, the UK is not going to do that by their basically bowing over and allowing the US to continue with this procedure against Julian Assange. I think it's a definite hypocrisy, and maybe the world should be called on it. Here is the opportunity to stand up to this sort of, for lack of a better term, aggression against freedoms, against people's right to know and their right to act. So I think there is a definite hypocrisy that the world should be ashamed that it is perpetuating.
I like your use of our slogan, Jeffrey. Right to know, freedom to act. I caught that one. Does anyone else want to answer this one, or should I move into the final question of the hour?
You can ask the final question.
Final answer. If Assange is convicted or even just extradited to the U.S. to face 17 counts under the Espionage Act for publishing information about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the Guantanamo Bay prison camps, the State Department cables, information that was also published by or in conjunction with the New York Times, Der Spiegel, Al Jazeera, Le Monde, El País, La Repubblica. I'm sure I'm missing a few. What is the ramifications for that for both journalism in the U.S. and press freedom around the world? If this persecution goes through, what does the future of press freedom look like?
If I can jump in,
of course, Jeffrey.
I think there's dire warnings here. It can, the handwriting on the wall of this threat to the press in general was happening during my trial. Yet the mainstream media, pretty much the same way with Assange, had no reason to pay any attention. The only time the mainstream media paid attention to my case was when one of their own was threatened with being sent to jail for not revealing his source. So during the course of my trial and the interlocutory appeals, the government gained that final right. It was finally made clear that the government could go after whoever it wanted to with regard to classified information, particularly using the Espionage Act. So now, and to me, the High Court last week basically opened that door even wider, giving the U.S. justification to go after whoever they want to. As long as the U.S. can make some tie to classified information, they can use the Espionage Act to go after anyone. So the mainstream media, other media outlets who have not paid much attention to what has been going on, what had gone on with my case, what is going on with Assange, must know that they are firmly in the crosshairs of a vindictive U.S. government. If any information is produced that embarrasses the U.S. government. So I think there's more attention needs to happen. And I think with the situation with Assange, it just shows the dire need for more press outlets to stand up and make their feelings known about this in a press freedom context.
Kevin, I know you have thoughts on this question.
Well, I mean, there's also the issue of whether or not Julian Assange or anyone who isn't a U.S. citizen should have to follow U.S. law. I think that is something that people are beginning to grasp. I know that it's coming from the right, the political right within Australia, but Barnaby Joyce, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, is saying things to the extent of, and others are recognizing along with him, that the issue here is whether Australians are going to be committing crimes, and then they're going to find that other countries see the signal that the U.S. is sending out, that they can prosecute people for not following their own laws. So there's this kind of, to use a euphemism from the United States, wild, wild west vibe that people should be getting from what the U.S. is doing in marking new territory here by pursuing this case against Julian Assange. And so I think, you know, that's truly something that people need to contemplate here. I don't know. People don't really think of it in these terms, but I would close with this statement. Everyone was really upset and bothered by President George W. Bush's administration and the way that, you know, Dick Cheney and others were claiming new powers. There were plenty of books written about the imperial presidency. You know, we saw those. There were parallels between some of the things that were written and what happened with Richard Nixon's administration. And the same could be said for President Donald Trump's administration. But we've also seen that under Democratic president like Barack Obama and now Joe Biden, people are far more willing to believe that they are going to be reasonable and they're going to exercise great care in the way that they use this power, which has allowed for the expansion of certain, like drone warfare. We've seen laws become stretched. You know, the legal boundaries have been stretched. We've seen them claim that they can take certain actions that if a Republican president does it, we are supremely outraged to see them making those steps. And I think that there are people who wrongly believe that Joe Biden and his administration know how to handle this prosecution of Assange with care so that it does not jeopardize press freedom, and are actually going to maybe handle it better than the Trump administration would. Like they're going to figure out some way to do this that doesn't affect journalists. And I think that's a kind of ignorance or hubris that people within the media establishment should not have, and people who care about democracy and human rights should not have. Because the fact of the matter is the way, you know, the way they are going about it is not going to exclude them. And in the end, if you don't challenge Joe Biden for doing this, if you don't challenge Attorney General Merrick Garland for not dropping the charges and ending this case, then you are opening up a future where the next Republican president, which we can expect we will have since there are political pendulum swings in the U.S. repeatedly, then they might turn on the New York Times or the Washington Post and their editors, or they might want to go after someone at CNN. We survived a Trump administration where people were repeatedly committed to investigating Donald Trump and targeting his administration for reasons that were, you know, by and large, most of the time justified in looking at the corruption within his administration. But think of the next president who's a Republican who believes that he is being unfairly targeted and needs to go after his enemies in the press. And we could imagine them using a precedent set by this Julian Assange case to maybe go after someone who's a national security reporter at the New York Times, or some kind of a political reporter at the Washington Post, who is publishing sensitive material. And I don't think we should believe that that's out of the realm of possibility, because if the politics shift enough, they can make people fearful. All they have to do is create the climate of fear like they've done around Julian Assange. And then once they do that, they can punish and target anybody.
Thank you, Kevin. And Stefania, the fate of...
Yes, Chip. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that if they are able to extradite Julian Assange and put him in prison for life, because this is what they want, I don't have any. I mean, I don't believe they will. They will give him a sentence for a few years. They are after him to crush him, to destroy him once and for all. If they can do this, and if they will do it to the whole WikiLeaks organization, and not just Julian Assange, to the all the WikiLeaks journalists and so on. And I want to stress this because we always discuss the Julian Assange case, but this case is about the full organization, the whole organization. If they are able to do this, it will be devastating. It will be the 9/11 of press freedom. It will mean that we no longer live in a democracy. I mean, in a democracy, you have to be able to, the public, the journalists and the public have to be able to know to expose state criminality at the highest level. This is the difference between a democracy and an authoritarian state. In an authoritarian state, you cannot do it because they kill you or they put in jail for life. In a democracy, it must be possible to do it. So we must defend this right because it's about our democracy. And if they can do it, it will be the end of democracy. It's not an exaggeration. Of course, they do it with Julian Assange because an easy target. If we compare to the New York Times, or if we compare to the Washington Post, who are highly influential, very often in bed with their government, so they don't dare to attack them directly. But we all will be the next. So we'll be, and the public will be the next. Their right to know will be destroyed. It means that you don't have the right to know the state criminality at the highest level. You just have the right to know the corruption, the mafia story, and things like that, but not real, actual state criminalities. We must defend this right to know the dirty secrets of the highest level of power. And let me close this conversation with one last thing. We have invested a lot of energies to follow this legal case, to follow the hearings and the appeal and whatever. I have no trust whatsoever in this legal process. This power, this level of power is granted enjoys complete impunity, not just because the judges are corrupt. We are the demonstration. We had our judges and prosecutors able to nail the CIA agents responsible for the CIA rendition. They were able to get a final sentence, and yet these people have never ever spent a single day in prison. This power is completely enjoys complete impunity. So how can we think that this legal process, the 300 appeals Julian Assange went through, can achieve anything? They won't. The only hope for Julian Assange is for people taking to the street and a large protest, people taking the street. Don't have any hope in the judges in the court. They won't provide any justice for this case. This power is accountable to no one. They are untouchable.
Thank you very much. And I want to inform people that today is December the 15th, which in the United States of America is Bill of Rights Day. I don't know how many people out there watching know it's Bill of Rights Day, but Bill of Rights Day was created by proclamation by Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a day set apart for the mobilization for freedom and for human rights, a day of remembrance of the democratic and peaceful action by which these rights were gained, and a day of reassessment of their present meaning and their living worth. With the future of our First Amendment in the balance, I can think of no better way than to commemorate Bill of Rights Day with a mobilization for freedom and human rights to tell Congress that we cannot leave this to the UK court system. We cannot leave this to Joseph Biden and Merrick Garland. We couldn't leave it to Donald Trump, but that Congress, the people's house, needs to rise up and take action to not only speak out for Julian Assange and Daniel Hale and these other people being persecuted, but to actually amend the Espionage Act to make it so that these prosecutions are impossible. Last week, Representative Rashida Tlaib introduced an amendment to the Protecting Our Democracy Act that would have put forward a number of landmark reforms to the Espionage Act, including forcing prosecutors to prove specific intent of harm to national security and making sure the information in question was properly classified, as well as creating a public interest defense for those charged under the Espionage Act and permitting them the right to testify about the purpose of their disclosures. The Rules Committee refused to allow Congress to vote on it, but last week we came very close to a once in 103-year vote on the Espionage Act. And that amendment is quite mild, and there's a lot of other things that need to be done to take on the Espionage Act. But here at Defending Rights in Dissent, we are building support, not just for Julian Assange, not just for Daniel Hale, not just for reality winner Edward Snowden, but to actually take on the law that has been used to silence them. If you go to rightsanddissent.org/take action right now, you can join us in a Bill of Rights Day mobilization for freedom and human rights and contact your member of Congress. Tell them, I'm concerned with the attacks on Julian Assange, and I want you to take efforts to reform the Espionage Act. I cannot sit here and tell you that if we do everything in our power and fight as hard as we possibly can, that we will undeniably, unequivocally save Julian, save our First Amendment. But I can tell you what, if we do not fight, if we do not stand up, if we do not rise to the occasion in this moment, Julian will not be saved. This prosecution will go forward. Last week, the night before the UK High Court made its atrocious decision, Steve Donziger, the environmental lawyer who took on Chevron, was released from prison onto house arrest. His case is one of the most shameful abuses of the criminal justice system. And the reason he was released was because of independent media, broadcast like this one, and the people who mobilized, grassroots activists who mobilized to free him. He's not as free as he should be. He's still under house arrest, but his case shows the power of grassroots activism, the power of the people. And I would also remind people that in the waning days of the Barack Obama administration, there was some talk that Obama might commute Chelsea Manning's sentence. And a lot of people said that if he didn't do that, she would die in prison. That was our last chance to save her life, the last chance to see some semblance of justice done to a heroic whistleblower who gave up so much in order so that we could have a debate about what our government was doing in our name in Iraq and Afghanistan. And a lot of people said there was no chance that would happen. It wasn't worth writing letters. It wasn't worth organizing. But we at Defending Rights in Dissent, we sent those letters. We wrote those letters. We mobilized people, and Chelsea Manning was set free. We freed Steve Donziger. We freed Chelsea Manning, and we, the people, can free Julian. We can bring Edward Snowden home. We can bring Daniel Hale home, but we have to actually organize and take the steps to do this. So I invite you right now to log on to rightsanddissent.org/take action and tell your member of Congress you're concerned with Julian Assange, you're concerned with the Espionage Act, because if we do not fight this, they will get away with it. And I know we have very, very powerful enemies. We have the FBI, the CIA, The NSA are against us. The companies that make the bombs that kill children and make a bunch of money doing so are against us. Stenographers masquerading as journalists who repeat every lie the national security state tells us is against us. The Obama administration, Mike Pompeo, both parties have people in them against us, but they are no match for the power of we the people when we take collective action together. And I invite you to join us on Bill of Rights Day to fight to save press freedom, to fight to save Julian, and to fight to finally take on the draconian 103-year Espionage Act. And it concludes our broadcast, and in the modified words of Edward Murrow, good day and good luck.